There is indeed a sound to every living thing upon this earth. A cloud at sunset, a tree, a flower, the growth of coral. They say that if our ears were fine enough tuned, that we could hear these many sounds as they circulate our airwaves. Of all the sounds that mix upon this earth, the sounds of poverty are among the cruelest and often lead to outward forms of discontent. This is Grenada in the 1950s.
Закончится здесь. Сейчас ты упадешь и истечешь кровью. Я еще только распинаюсь, жалкий червяк. Произошло убийство, шагонючий меня. И думаешь, осторожно чтение.
This is Resilience of the Spice Isle. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for joining us. Our first episode introduced the island's many parallels and ended with a discussion on the coming of Eric Geiri in the mid-1950s and his formation of the trade union and its associated powers.
The way that Geiri had become a politician was in this almost in a Bustamante type style. Very little party structure and such, but a popular labor leader who was able to mobilize mass of people effectively.
And what Geiri does is to turn that trade union power into political power. So he starts the Grenada United Labour Party. And it happens at a time when Grenada is now moving towards universal adult suffrage. So prior to this, if you own property, you got a chance to vote. If you did not own property, as was the majority of the population, you had no ability to vote. With universal adult suffrage coming in 1951, Geiri now goes up for elections to the Legislative Council, and he wins the elections, hands down.
Barry Shaw, I would say, probably barely held on to his seat. Geiri was almost like a kind of a wind of change.
Geiri worked mainly in the rural community, but most of Grenada was actually almost rural. There was estates in the largest parish, St. George, Woodlands area, Belmont area, Springs, that is areas down in the south of the island, right throughout, particularly on the eastern coast, St. David and St. Andrew area. So the bulk of persons were working in agriculture. So he mobilized these people, and gradually they were able to earn some better working condition. And that struggle for the workers' right continued right through.
There was another political party which was more conservative, the Grenada National Party. Geiri was able to, defeat them in most elections. I mean, I know, for instance, in the early 60s, Geiri's party dominated the political process in Grenada.
So he became known as Uncle Geiri. There's a lot of mythology around him. He's an interesting political character. His followers became known as Geiriites. And even today you would hear people say, my father was a Geiriite, or my mother was a Geiriite. The women in the countryside used to say, Geiri taught us how to wear bra and panties. That even something as fundamental as that they may not have had access to.
Women in Grenada used to walk with long skirts, and it was Geiri that brought boots. So for the first time, women with boots. For the first time, they were able to walk with pants. They had to carry loads from far out, and talking about 3 miles with wet cocoa. Women had to carry that with basket to bring to the drying point. The thing is, you harvest the cocoa, you have to sweat the cocoa, then you dry it, and then you process it and then ship it out. That is what was being done. So when you harvest it on the estate, you had to bring it to those points where you can actually what they call sweat the cocoa. But Geiri then stopped that. He forced estate owners to develop pathways where the distance was shorter, so women didn't have to carry those kind of loads. So he did a lot for people.
And some people refer to 1951 as a revolution. That Geiri basically changed the course of Grenada's history with the skyway in 1951. And even though he was criticized heavily by the Negro movement and the guys that were the revolution, Ford, who was the deputy prime minister in the PRG, has written about Skyrack, and now they're actually crediting Gary, even though as the opposition to Gary, they did not see fit to do it at that time, but they're now recognizing what Gary did in 1951 in terms of the road that Grenada was put on at that point.
So he's basically at the forefront of Grenada's politics from 51 up to 79. He lost the elections twice, and that was because of naughty behavior on his, I'm going to say naughty, in inverted commas, behavior on his part. He lost elections twice during that period, but he basically had the support of the people. He showed by trade union action that you can use a trade union to put pressure on plantation owners to be able to get wage increases, because once this happens in 51, you find other unions now coming to the fore and putting pressure, whether it was plantation owners, in some instances you have shop owners, so asking for things like increasing wages of clerks, shop assistants and so on, starting putting that kind of pressure. So recognizing that you can use a trade union and you can, even if it's just a strike action, these things can actually happen. So that was Grenada in the 1950s into the 1960s. Gary's basically at the helm. He moves from winning the election, so he's part of the head of the Legislative Council, then he becomes Premier, and eventually he moves to Prime Minister, with Grenada asking for independence. So we would have joined the Federation like everybody else, and when Eric Williams says one best math problem in the world, 1 minus 10 equals 0. After that, of course, the Federation falls apart. We join the Little Eight, but that doesn't necessarily last. So Grenada becomes the first of the Windward Islands to ask for independence and to gain independence. But our move to independence was not smooth. All the other islands of the Windward Islands and Leewards as well had a gentle transition. Our transition was far from being gentle. With most politicians, somewhere along the line, there's always some naughty behavior and what I call very nicely political malfeasance. But you have it happening, and it would have happened in Gary's case. So I think it's 57. He gets suspended because he basically sent a marching band through somebody else's bid for elections. So of course you're campaigning and he sends a marching band through the campaign. So he gets reprimanded by the British government, and it gets serious, more serious as time goes on. By 62, he is called up by the British government for misuse of government funds.
That was called Squandermania. That was the name given to that. So what it was, through the course from 1951 on, there were different constitutional changes that gave more and more power to local elected officials and their participation in government. We still had an administrator and a lieutenant governor, but nonetheless, we kept making these changes so we're local. So Eric Gary, his party had won a plurality of seats, so they were in charge of the internal governance. And with that, they controlled finance and things like that. So in the course of that, I guess they had just designated Mongolia as the prime minister. So in going to live in those residents, I guess he felt he had to have a certain standard. So he wanted certain things in there. So in the course of purchasing things for there, one of them being a baby grand piano, I guess the administrator felt that the process of acquiring some of these things were not fitted with their procedures, that people were forced into signing off on things. So as a result of that, an investigation was started by the Lloyd at the time, and he, after the investigation, concluded that there was corruption because procedures were not followed and stuff like that. So in that, he decided the Gulf government at the time, Grenada United Labour Party, which was running things in ministries, he felt that they should not be left in control. So he squashed the constitution at the time and took over governance by the administrator and whatever structures, the colonial structure, got back in place. And that period was referred to as Squandermania. I think it was coined by T.M. Arisho in his newspaper. In 1962, this happened. It wasn't the first time that Eric Gairy got into issues with the government because he pushed the colonial structure, definitely. I think Gairy supporters definitely felt that it was a witch hunt, that there was an attempt to silence Gairy and to get him out of politics. That's why these things were done by the colonial structure, because they were afraid of Gairy and the command he had of the followers and things like that. So Gairy was basically kicked out of office. And the opposition, Grenada National Party, on the Herbert Blaze, came into power in that period. And in that period, we also had a push to go to join the Trinidad. Because there was a period when Trinidad, under Eric Williams, he wanted to bring St. Vincent and Grenada as part of a state. This was when the Little Eight was going on with Barbados, because Federation had just failed, with one from 10 Leagues North, as Eric Williams put it, when Jamaica pulled out following their referendum. So Eric Williams decided maybe I could get St. Vincent. And what a lot of people don't know is that Eric Williams was actually thinking of bringing them on because they were predominantly black countries, and their black population would swell the Indian population in Trinidad, which is a lot of people are not aware, but those were some of the machinations that were going on in the background, you know. And of course, nothing came of it because even though Grenadians, they were ready, they were set. Grenadians actually called it the Go Trinidad movement. And they were on schooners headed to Trinidad, and there was a lot of backlash against all the Grenadian immigrants in Trinidad, even though Trinidadian society, one would say, was built by all these immigrants coming in. Trinidad did not have a population. Well, they had 3,000 people back in the 1770s when the Grenadians started going to Trinidad. You know, Carnival in Trinidad is a result of all of the Grenadians and others who had gone there because Trinidad became a French colony without a French governance because of all these French who went there with their culture, and that's why today, you know, you see Trinidadian society and reflected from Grenadian society and vice versa, of course. You know, so I think the Squandermania was an interesting thing which I think we don't talk about much because it just seemed like it was just a simple, but it really had all of these other consequences, things that were going on in all the islands, East the Caribbean. You know, there was a Calypsonian that had a song about the thing with Little Eight and union with Trinidad, you know, and Gairy was more for Little Eight because he felt that if he joined up with Trinidad, that Eric Williams would be the more dominant, whereas Blaze, who was the opposition, had actually proposed the union with Trinidad, and Blaze won the elections as a result. So yeah, it was one of those interesting episodes. Once Gairy got back, which of course Gairy used to get back in power, saying, hey, we didn't do the Trinidad thing. Gairy remained in power until he was overthrown after that. So after that Squandermania, Gairy came back to power stronger than ever. And he ended up winning the 1972 elections with 13 of the 15 seats, and he used that as a manifesto on his manifesto that we will get independence. And Gairy had said, I don't want to ask you for independence, I want you to give it to me. And they said, well, you need to show us that the people are behind you. So he did that in the 72 elections, and he's like, he took it as a mandate when he won 13 of the 15 seats. And when they tried to challenge him with that, he's like, dude, I'm sorry, but I already beat you guys in the court. I see what the argument is. And we ended up going to independence. So you can see how these other events, you know, contributed to to the whole political scene at the time.
Произошло убийство!
His belief in UFOs, unidentified flying objects, became a laughing, joking thing because he would go to the United Nations and advocated for research into UFOs. I remember a joke a cartoon that appeared after the revolution, and they went to Mr. Gary with the mic and they said, "We heard the government has been taken over," and the joke was it by UFO? So that was something that I think we sort of became a laughing stock from some people, and for anybody that's in power for a long period. I think you begin to see the flaws more than whatever good they may have done.
Even before he became Prime Minister, he decreased in the number of hours worked, but increasing labor. The building of many medical centers throughout Grenada, the building of playing fields. I think under his reign, you had more schools being constructed. So, and what probably distinguished Gary from any other of the leaders since then is that his affinity and his embracing of the Grenadian culture or the Afro-Caribbean culture. To me, in my mind, he was the ultimate revolutionary. Because I don't believe any revolution can be built on an ideology that is foreign. And with Gary, actually, he was seen encouraging the pan, embracing the drums, actually being involved with people that were we call the Shango people, the Baptist people. So he was a champion of the people and he embraced the culture. I know of situations where he actually used to bring drummers from Grenada to Caribbean, the drummers into Grenada. And because of his association with the people at the grassroots level, at some time he was considered too. And that was a slogan that was labeled at him, or propaganda slogan by the revolution, as an opium, because of his embracing of the African culture in Grenada. He actually led in terms of getting Grenadian scholarship, not just building and passing on secondary schools, allowing many young people to go to secondary schools, but also offering scholarship to places like even as far as Australia and Guyana to study agriculture, things like that. So he was a serious champion for the people cause. Under Gary reign, we saw the greatest